Woman didn't just locate him. She tried to tear the flag down, had workers dig up his front yard, and even filed a false complaint to the county, all in a desperate attempt to destroy one veteran's stand for freedom. But what she didn't know, he had a few surprises of his own. And when her dirty little secret got exposed, let's just say she ended up in handcuffs instead of a board meeting. This story is shocking, and we want to know, have you ever dealt with the homeowner association nightmare like this? Let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story where justice gets served. Colonel James Harper, 72-year-old honored veteran, had lived in his suburban neighborhood for over 2 decades. He was a quiet, respectful man, known for his morning walks, his well-kept front lawn, and his deep love for his country. So when the 4th of July approached, it was only natural for him to raise a large, spotless American flag on a brand new flagpole in his front yard. The sight was stunning. A 10-ft pole with the stars and stripes waving proudly in the summer breeze. Neighbors admired it. Passing drivers slowed down to appreciate it. But there was one person who saw it as a direct challenge to her power. Margaret Karen Holloway, the head of the homeowner association. The first warning came in the form of a neatly typed letter taped to James's front door. It read, "Mr. Harper, your recent installation of a large flagpole in your yard is an offense of homeowner association guidelines. You are required to remove it within 48 hours, or you will be subject to penalties." James read the letter, chuckled to himself, and placed it on his kitchen counter. Without a second thought, he had lived in this neighborhood long before Karen had forced her way onto the homeowner association board, and in all his years, he had never heard of such a rule. He decided to ignore the warning. After all, this was his land, his home, and his flag. 2 days later, the second notice arrived, this time via certified mail. It was more forceful. Final warning: your unauthorized flagpole violates Homeowner Association Regulations Section 12B. Failure to comply will result in an immediate penalty of $100 per day, starting on the 5th of July. James sighed, shaking his head. "This woman has too much time on her hands," he muttered, tossing the letter aside. That evening, he called his old war buddy Tom, a fellow veteran and retired lawyer. "Can she actually do this?" James asked. Tom laughed dryly. "On the other end, sounds like she's making rules out of thin air. Stand your ground." But Karen wasn't done yet. On the morning of the 5th of July, James woke up to find a bright red violation sign planted on his lawn. Bold capital letters screamed out, "Infraction penalties pending." The fine had now jumped to $500, with an additional $100 per day if he didn't remove the flagpole immediately. Neighbors walking their dogs paused in shock, whispering among themselves. Some shook their heads in disappointment, not at James, but at the sheer stubbornness of the homeowner association that evening. As James sat on his porch sipping a cold glass of lemonade, Karen herself appeared. She was a petite woman in her 50s, dressed in a stiff, perfectly ironed pantsuit, her signature clipboard gripped tightly in one hand. Her short, blonde bob barely moved as she marched up his driveway with the confidence of a ruler inspecting her troops. "Mr. Harper," she began, forcing a tight-lipped smile, "I assume you received our notices?" James leaned back, crossing his arms. "Oh, I received them all right." Karen's smile faded. "Then I assume you understand the consequences of your actions. Homeowner association regulations are in place to maintain the consistency and appearance of our community." James raised an eyebrow. "So an American flag is somehow a problem for this neighborhood?" Karen huffed, frustrated. "The issue is the flagpole. It's too tall, it disrupts the view, and it's not in your control." "Karen," James interrupted, his voice steady but firm. Karen's nostrils flared. "If you do not remove it by tomorrow morning, you will be fined $1,000, and if the fines aren't paid, the homeowner association has the right to place a claim on your home." James's heart pounded in his chest, not from fear, but from pure, uncontrollable anger. He had fought for his country, risked his life for the very freedom Karen was trying to take away. And now, this paperwork-obsessed dictator wanted to take his home. Over a flagpole, he stood slowly towering over her. "You do whatever you think you need to do, Karen. But let me tell you this. That flag isn't coming down." Karen scoffed, stepping back. "You'll regret this," she sneered, before storming away. As James watched her leave, a few neighbors quietly clapped from their driveways. The battle had begun. James Harper knew a fight when he saw one, and this was no different. He had fought in 2 wars, faced real enemies, and stood his ground under attack. If Karen thought a few documents and some penalties would make him surrender, she was completely mistaken. That night, he sat on his porch staring at the flag swaying gracefully in the summer breeze, illuminated by the warm glow of the porch light. He had never felt more determined in his life. The next morning, James woke up to the sound of hammering. He pulled open his curtains and froze. A contractor, hired by the homeowner association, was in his front yard attempting to remove the flagpole. James burst through the front door, marching straight toward the surprised worker, who looked up from his tools in confusion. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" James demanded, his voice steady and strong. The worker, a middle-aged man in a safety vest, wiped sweat from his forehead. I was hired by the homeowner association to take this down. Said it was approved." James's hands curled into fists. "Did they tell you it belongs to a United States veteran? That it's on my private property?" The worker hesitated, suddenly looking uneasy. "Look, sir, I'm just doing my job." James cut him off. "No, you're about to commit trespassing and destruction of private property. You touch that pole and I'll have you arrested." The worker swallowed hard, taking a step back. Clearly, he had not agreed to this kind of confrontation. "I'll call my boss," he stammered, before quickly retreating to his truck. James watched as the man drove away, kicking up dust. But his victory was brief, because Karen was watching. She stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, lips curled in a smug grin, like a vulture waiting to pick at a Marcus. "You're making this a lot harder than it needs to be, Mr. Harper," she called out, her voice dripping with mockery. James turned to face her, his jaw clenched like a steel trap. "And you're making this a lot more personal than it needs to be, Karen." Karen let out a taunting laugh. "This isn't personal. It's about rules. This neighborhood has expectations, and I won't let you disrupt that." James took a step closer, his sharp blue eyes locking onto hers. "Karen, tell me something. Why is it that every other house in this neighborhood can have holiday decorations, garden gnomes, and fountains, but my flagpole is the only thing that suddenly breaks your so-called rules?" For the first time, Karen looked visibly unsettled. She opened her mouth, then quickly shut it. "That's different," she finally said, struggling for control of the conversation. James smirked. "No, it's not. This is about you and your obsession with authority. You don't like being told no, and you sure as hell don't like when someone stands up to you." Karen's cheeks flushed red, but she quickly regained her posture. "Well, Mr. Harper, since you refuse to comply, I'm afraid the homeowner association will be issuing additional penalties. Expect an updated notice this evening." With that, she turned on her heel and marched away, her clipboard bouncing against her hip. But James was ready. That afternoon, James called his lawyer friend Tom again. This time, the conversation was all strategy. "She's crossing a serious legal boundary," Tom said, his voice serious. "First off, she has zero power to penalize you over a flagpole. Federal law protects your right to display the American flag on residential property. Second, she just tried to have it removed without due process. That's damage to property. If she pushes this any further, you could have a strong case against her." James nodded, a plan forming in his mind. "Then it's time to fight back." That evening, as promised, Karen delivered another penalty notice, this time for $1,500. But James wasn't bothered. Instead of backing down, he did something Karen never expected. He installed a second flagpole. The next morning, when Karen stepped outside, she was greeted with the sight of 2 massive American flags fluttering side by side in James's yard. The neighborhood was alive, some in pure admiration, others laughing at Karen's inevitable outburst. An outburst she did. Karen stormed over, red-faced and practically furious. "What is this?" she screamed, pointing at the second flag. James, casually sipping his morning coffee, grinned. "Oh, that's called freedom." Karen's eye twitched. "That's called a direct offense. You're making things worse for yourself, Mr. Harper." James leaned in slightly, his grin widening. "You started this, Karen. Now I'm going to finish it." The neighborhood watched in stunned silence, realizing something massive was about to happen. James wasn't just fighting for his flag anymore. He was fighting for every homeowner, tired of Karen's dominance. And the war had just begun. The sight of two massive American flags flying boldly in Colonel James Harper's yard sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. For years, many residents had quietly disliked Karen and her strict control over the homeowner association, but no one had ever dared to challenge her like this. People drove by, slowing their cars to admire James's stand against the homeowner association rule, and neighbors lingered on their lawns, whispering among themselves. It wasn't just about the flag anymore. It was about resistance against unfair power. Karen, however, was fuming. She had spent years carefully crafting her position as the self-appointed queen of the homeowner association, ruling with an iron clipboard and an endless supply of penalty notices. Now, James's public act of resistance was making her look weak, and the homeowner association board members were taking notice that evening. As the sun set over the spotless suburban streets, James received an unexpected knock on his door. When he opened it, he found three of his neighbors standing there: Tom Willis, a retired firefighter; Lisa Monroe, a schoolteacher; and Greg Dorson, a small business owner. They all wore the same expression, part concern, part admiration. "Colonel," Tom said, tipping his baseball cap, "we just wanted to stop by and say we support you." James raised an eyebrow. "Support me?" Lisa nodded, stepping forward. "You're doing what all of us have wanted to do for years. Karen's been misusing her position for too long. She's handed out absurd penalties, shut down neighborhood events, and even forced families to repaint their homes just because she didn't like the color. But you're standing up to her, and we want to help." James leaned against his door frame, studying their faces. These were good people. People who had tolerated Karen's nonsense for far too long. "What exactly are you suggesting?" James asked, curious. Greg smirked, crossing his arms. "A neighborhood rebellion." Lisa pulled out a stack of printed papers and handed them to James. "These are copies of the homeowner association's bylaws. We spent the last 2 nights going through them, and guess what? Nowhere in these rules does it say anything about flagpoles." James whistled low, flipping through the documents. "So Karen's been making up the rules as she goes?" Tom nodded. "Exactly. And it's not just about you, Colonel. She's done this to all of us. We think it's time we question her authority." James grinned. "Now, that's something I can get behind." Over the next several days, something unbelievable happened. More flags started appearing. First, it was Tom Willis who installed a flagpole identical to James's, right in his front yard. Then Lisa Monroe put up a banner across her porch that read, "This home respects those who served." Then the Dorson, the Andersons, and the Martinez family followed along. Within a week, there were over 20 American flags proudly displayed throughout the neighborhood. It wasn't just a protest anymore. It was a movement. Karen watched in disbelief as her carefully controlled suburban community transformed into a patriotic stand. Every morning, she would drive through the neighborhood, her face twisted in frustration as she saw more and more flags appearing on porches, lawns, fences, and even mailboxes. Finally, Karen lost control. She called for an emergency homeowner association meeting. The invitation was mandatory, posted on every resident's door, demanding attendance at the neighborhood clubhouse. The agenda: unauthorized decorations and community standards enforcement. James knew exactly what this meant. Karen was going to try to pressure everyone to remove their flags. So He came prepared. On the night of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed. More residents showed up than had ever been seen at a homeowner association meeting before. Some were there out of curiosity, others out of frustration. But the vast majority, they were there to support James. Karen stood at the front of the room, clipboard in hand, her thin lips pressed into a tight line as she looked out over the crowd. She was used to running these meetings with absolute control, but tonight the power had shifted. She cleared her throat. We are here tonight because of an ongoing issue with non-compliant homeowners who have deliberately ignored community regulations by installing unauthorized flagpoles. A murmur of disapproval rippled through the crowd. James, seated in the front row, stood up. Karen, he said, his voice carrying through the room. We all know this isn't about flagpoles. This is about you misusing your power. Gasps echoed through the room. Karen's eyes narrowed. That's ridiculous. I'm simply enforcing the rules. There are no rules against flagpoles, Karen, Lisa cut in, holding up the printed copies of the homeowner association bylaws. We checked. Karen froze, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The crowd erupted in murmurs. Greg stood up next. The real issue here is how many of us you've harassed over the years. How many people here have been fined for pointless violations? Nearly half. The room raised their hands. Karen stiffened, her grip tightening on her clipboard. She was losing control fast. Before she could regain the room, James delivered the final blow. This ends tonight, he said, his voice firm, unwavering. We're calling for a vote of no confidence in your leadership, Karen. The room exploded into cheers. Karen's face went pale. For the first time ever, she wasn't the one in charge, and she knew it. The tide had turned, but Karen wasn't finished yet, and her next move would take things to a whole new level. Karen sat in her pristine white leather office chair, staring at her laptop screen, her fingers clenching and unclenching against her desk. The homeowner association meeting had been a disaster. She had never lost control like that before, never seen so many people defy her at once. It was humiliating. And worse, James Harper was at the center of it all. For years, she had kept the neighborhood in check, making sure it maintained its perfect appearance, keeping property values high, and most importantly, keeping herself in control. And now, this old veteran was uniting people against her, making her look powerless. She refused to let it happen. She opened the homeowner association violation system, her mind racing. She needed to send a message, something that would crush this rebellion fast. And then a ruthless idea struck her. If penalties weren't enough, then she would go one step further. By the time the next morning arrived, James Harper was woken by the sound of loud voices outside his house. He pulled on his robe and stepped outside, only to freeze mid-step. His front yard was crawling with workers, all wearing bright orange vests, moving like an invading army. One was yanking out his mailbox, another was tearing up his flower beds, and a third was climbing a ladder toward his flagpole. James's blood boiled. What the hell is going on here? He barked, his voice booming across the yard. One of the workers, a stocky man with a clipboard, turned to him, looking slightly uneasy. Homeowner association orders, sir. We've been sent to remove non-compliant structures and conduct a mandatory yard compliance inspection. James's fists clenched. What compliance inspection? Before the worker could answer, a familiar, shrill voice cut through the morning air. Well, Mr. Harper, I see you're finally awake. Karen stood at the edge of his driveway, her arms crossed, her expression smug. James took a deep, slow breath, forcing himself to remain calm. Karen, what the hell is this? This, she said, gesturing to the chaos in his yard, is a full-scale property compliance review. You see, when I dug a little deeper, I found that you've been violating multiple homeowner association codes, not just with your unauthorized flagpole, but also with your mailbox height, unapproved garden installations, and exterior lighting. James gritted his teeth. That's nonsense, and you know it. Karen tilted her head with an infuriatingly fake smile. It's all in the BWS, Mr. Harper. And since you refuse to comply voluntarily, The homeowner association is now exercising its right to enforce compliance. That means we can correct these issues ourselves at your expense. James's hands shook with anger. You're tearing up my yard, destroying my property, and you think I'm going to allow this? Karen's smile widened. Oh, I don't think, Mr. Harper. I know. James took one slow step forward, his voice dropping dangerously low. You come near that flagpole and you'll regret it. Karen's eyes gleamed with satisfaction, sensing victory. Oh, you mean this? She asked, motioning to the worker already climbing up the ladder. James's heart pounded. The worker reached for the fastening clips, his hands grasping the metal pole. Don't you dare! A new voice cut through the tension like a knife. Everyone turned. Standing at the edge of the driveway was Tom Willis, the retired firefighter, and at least a dozen other neighbors, all watching in furious disbelief. Lisa Monroe stepped forward, her arms crossed. Karen, what the hell are you doing? Karen sighed dramatically, looking at them like they were children throwing a tantrum. What I'm doing, she said, is enforcing order. Maybe if a few people actually read the homeowner association guidelines, instead of blindly following Mr. Harper's reckless rebellion, you'd understand that Greg Dorson stepped in beside James Karen. This is unlawful. Karen smirked. Is it? Because according to the homeowner association charter, the board has the power to carry out compliance enforcement actions when a homeowner refuses to correct violations. Lisa's jaw tightened. Yeah? And when was that voted on? Karen's smug smile twitched. That's what I thought, Lisa snapped. You didn't get board approval, did you? Karen stiffened. I don't need approval for routine compliance. Routine? Tom Willis barked. You're tearing up a man's yard over a damn flagpole, Karen. The crowd was growing. More neighbors were stepping out of their houses, watching in disbelief and frustration. Karen suddenly realized she was losing control. James saw her hesitation, and he took the opportunity. You know what, Karen? He said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. If you really think you're in the right here, then why don't we call the police and let them decide? Karen froze. The crowd erupted into murmurs. Lisa smirked. That's a great idea. Greg pulled out his phone. I'll call them right now. Karen went pale. James stepped closer, voice low and firm. You see, Karen, you didn't expect us to push back. You thought you could just intimidate us into surrender, but not this time. And definitely not me. Karen's eyes darted around, her mind racing. If the police got involved, this could explode in her face quickly. Finally, she snapped, her fingers at the workers. Pack it up, she gritted out. The workers hesitated. Now, she shouted. One by one, the orange-vested men packed up their tools and left, casting uneasy glances at the enraged crowd. James watched them go, his hands still clenched. At his sides, Karen turned to face him one last time, her eyes burning with pure fury. This isn't over, she hissed. James smiled. Oh, I know. But the next time you try something like this. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to a near whisper. I'll be ready. Karen spun on her heel and stormed off, her face burning red with embarrassment. The moment she was gone, the entire neighborhood erupted in cheers. James turned to Lisa, Greg, and Tom. That woman is going to come back swinging, he muttered. Lisa nodded. Then we'd better be ready. And they would be. Because Karen had just declared war. She had no idea what was coming next. Karen Holloway was fuming with fury. She had never been disgraced like that before. Not in her own neighborhood, not in front of her own homeowner association board members, and certainly not by a group of rebellious homeowners led by a stubborn old veteran. She spent the rest of the night fuming, pacing back and forth in her home office, gripping her homeowner association rulebook so tightly her knuckles turned white. This isn't over, she muttered to herself, her eyes scanning through the bylaws, desperately searching for anything at all, that would force James to comply. And then she found it. A single clause buried deep in the homeowner association's founding documents, a loophole that she could use, a way to take this battle to the next level. By morning, The entire neighborhood awoke to something shocking. Homeowner Association eviction notice plastered in bold red letters across James Harper's front door. Underneath it, an official document from the Homeowner Association, signed by Karen herself. Due to ongoing and repeated violations of Homeowner Association regulations, failure to comply with property rules, and refusal to adhere to neighborhood appearance standards, the Homeowner Association Board is moving forward with legal action to foreclose on this property. The words hit like a bombshell. James stared at the notice, his hands tightening into fists. This wasn't just a penalty anymore. This was an attempt to take his home. Within minutes, news spread like wildfire. Neighbors gathered in front of James' house reading the eviction notice in complete disbelief. The entire neighborhood was buzzing. People on their phones, others recording video footage, some even calling their own lawyers. And Karen was watching from her porch sipping coffee with the most self-satisfied expression imaginable. She thought she had won, but she had no idea what was about to happen next, because James had a friend in powerful places. By noon, an unexpected figure arrived in the neighborhood. A black SUV with government plates pulled up in front of James's house. The driver's side door opened, and out stepped Mayor David Reynolds. James had known David Reynolds for years. They had met at a veterans fundraiser event years ago, and while they weren't exactly close friends, they had respect for each other. And now, James needed a favor. The moment the mayor stepped out, the entire crowd fell silent. Karen, standing on her porch, suddenly went stiff. Mayor Reynolds took one look at the eviction notice, yanked it off the door, and turned to face James and the gathered crowd. "This," he said, holding the document up, "is absolute nonsense." The crowd erupted in cheers. Karen, suddenly panicking, stormed down her driveway. "Excuse me, Mr. Mayor, but this is a homeowner association matter, and you have no power here." The mayor turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Oh, but I do, Miss Holloway," he said, his voice cold and firm. "Because the state of your state has a law that overrides homeowner association regulations when it comes to flag display on private property." Karen froze. James grinned. Mayor Reynolds held up a printed document reading aloud, "Under the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act, signed into federal law in 2006. Homeowners associations are prohibited from enforcing restrictions that prevent residents from displaying the United States flag on their property." The crowd cheered even louder. Karen stammered, her confidence breaking before everyone's eyes. That's not valid here," she started, but the mayor interrupted her. "Oh, it absolutely is," he said. "And not only that, but you've also exceeded your legal power by issuing this fake eviction notice." Karen's face turned pale. The mayor turned to James. "Colonel Harper, I'll be personally ensuring that this entire situation is escalated to legal authorities. The homeowner association does not have the power to take your home, nor can they intimidate you into surrender." Karen tried one last time to resist. Well, I was just trying to maintain the standards of this community," she blurted out. Mayor Reynolds turned to her, his tone sharp as a blade. "No, Miss Holloway, you weren't maintaining standards, you were misusing your authority, and now you're it." And as the mayor left, shaking James's hand before stepping back into his SUV, the entire crowd erupted into a standing ovation. But this wasn't the end, because Karen wasn't finished yet, and what she did next would be her ultimate failure. Karen locked herself in her office, her hands shaking as she furiously typed on her laptop. The embarrassment from the homeowner association meeting, the public humiliation by the mayor, and the cheering crowd outside James Harper's house had pushed her to the edge. For years, she had ruled this neighborhood with an iron grip, and now her authority was collapsing before her eyes. She couldn't let this happen. There was only one way out now. She needed to bury James Harper in legal trouble before the homeowner association board or law enforcement buried her that night. She sent an anonymous report to the county zoning board falsely claiming that James Harper had made illegal modifications to his property, a clear violation of local Housing laws, she smirked as she hit send. Let's see how tough you are when the county comes knocking. Harper, she muttered to herself, convinced that she had finally found a way to shift the odds, but Karen had made a serious mistake because James Harper, he wasn't the one with something to hide. Karen was. The next morning, the neighborhood woke up to chaos. James had been served with an official notice from the county informing him that a complaint had been filed against his property. The document threatened heavy penalties and potential legal action if violations were found. James wasn't surprised. She's getting desperate, Lisa Monroe said, crossing her arms as they gathered on James's porch. This is her final move before she collapses. James nodded, calm and composed. She wants a battle. She's got one. What Karen didn't anticipate, however, was that her own dirty dealings were about to be uncovered because Tom Willis, the retired firefighter, had been investigating, and what he found would be Karen's downfall. That afternoon, Tom arrived at James's house with a folder full of documents. His face serious. Colonel, he said, handing over the paperwork, I think we just found a way to end this once and for all. James took the folder, flipping it open, and as he scanned the documents, his eyes widened. Where did you find this? He asked. Tom smirked. Public records. It took some searching, but let's just say Karen's been a very bad woman. Inside the folder were financial statements, homeowner association budgets, and fraudulent expenses. Karen had been stealing homeowner association funds for years. Thousands of dollars had been diverted into a private account under her name, disguised as maintenance costs and administrative fees. But that wasn't even the worst part. There was another document, one that directly linked Karen to a massive zoning violation. As it turned out, the very same county zoning board she had contacted about James had already been investigating Karen for unlawful property modifications to her own home. While Karen had been cracking down on minor violations, mailbox heights, exterior lights, flagpoles, she had been secretly expanding her own property, breaking multiple housing ordinances. She had added a large sunroom and an unauthorized underground wine cellar without any permits or approvals. James let out a low whistle. So she's been enforcing rules that she herself was ignoring. Tom nodded. And now, we take this public. The next morning, James walked into the homeowner association office with a mission. The moment he stepped inside, Karen's smug expression vanished. Oh, it's you, she scoffed, barely looking up from her desk. Here to plead for mercy? James smiled, but there was no warmth in it. No, he said, placing the folder full of damaging evidence onto her desk. I'm here to let you know that your rule of fear is over. Karen's brows furrowed as she flipped through the papers. As she realized what she was looking at, her face turned pale. This is fake, she stammered. James crossed his arms. Really? Because I already sent copies to the homeowner association board, the mayor's office, and the county zoning commission. Karen's hands trembled. You can't do this? Oh, but I already did, James said, leaning in slightly. And I imagine it won't be long before law enforcement does the rest. Karen shot up from her seat, panic flashing in her eyes. This is harassment. I'll sue you for this. James chuckled. Go ahead. But you might want to get a lawyer first, because when the homeowner association board finds out that you've been stealing their money, and when the county charges you for unlawful property modifications. He paused, letting the words sink in. You won't just be losing your homeowner association position. Karen swallowed hard. You'll be going to prison. The downfall of Karen Holloway happened faster than anyone expected. Within 24 hours, the homeowner association board voted to remove her from her role. Within 48 hours, the county zoning commission issued an official violation against her property, and within 1 week, she was served with an arrest warrant for embezzlement and fraud. On the day of her arrest, the entire neighborhood gathered to watch. Karen was dragged out of her house in handcuffs, screaming at the officers, shouting about how she was being framed, how it was all a mistake. But no one felt sympathy for her. James stood on his porch, arms crossed, watching as she was loaded into the back of a police car. Lisa turned to him. Well, I'd say that's justice served. Tom chuckled. And to think all of this happened because of a flagpole. James smiled, watching as the police car pulled away. No, he said, shaking his head. It happened because she thought she could dominate everyone. Lisa nodded. And now, James looked up at the American flag flying proudly in his yard. She's gone. The flag stays. And for the first time in years, the neighborhood was finally free. With Karen Holloway officially removed from power, the neighborhood felt like it had awakened from a long nightmare. People who had once tiptoed around in fear of her unfair penalties and unreasonable rules now felt free. It wasn't just about the flagpole anymore. It was about taking back control from a dictator who had ruled with an iron grip and a clipboard. James Harper, the man who had stood up to her, was now a symbol of resistance and victory. Neighbors who had once avoided conflict were now standing together, united in a way they never had before. But for James, the battle wasn't quite over yet. A week after Karen's arrest, the Homeowner Association board called for a special meeting, this time without her. James attended, expecting it to be just another formality. But what happened next surprised him. Lisa Monroe, the school teacher who had supported James throughout the conflict, stood up before the room. "The board has decided," she announced, her voice steady. "From this day forward, we are eliminating all excessive penalties, reversing every unfair violation that Karen issued in the last 5 years." And she turned to James. "We'd like to formally apologize to Colonel Harper." James raised an eyebrow. "Apologize?" Lisa nodded. "For everything. For allowing her to dominate this community, for letting her get away with it for so long, and most of all, for what she did to you." The room erupted in applause. James stood slowly, feeling the weight of everything finally lift off his shoulders. "I didn't do this for an apology," he said, his voice carrying through the room. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." Karen thought she could control people through intimidation, but intimidation only works until someone stands up to it. Tom Willis, the retired firefighter, stood up and grinned. "Well, Colonel, you sure as hell stood up to it." The applause grew louder, and then Lisa pulled out an official document. "There's one more thing," she said. "We voted on it this morning." She turned the page over, showing it to James. "A plaque dedication request in honor of Colonel James Harper, defender of our community." James blinked, stunned. "What is this?" Lisa smiled. "We're renaming the neighborhood park after you." For the first time in a long time, James felt his throat tighten with emotion. He had spent his whole life serving his country. He had fought for freedom, justice, and integrity, but he never expected to be honored in return. His eyes softened as he looked at the document in front of him. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. Lisa smiled. "Say yes." James chuckled, shaking his head. All right. But let's get one thing straight. If you're naming it after me, I want a big damn flagpole, right?" In the center, the room erupted in laughter and cheers. Lisa grinned. "Done." Karen's final fate. Meanwhile, Karen Holloway sat in a courtroom, her face drained of its usual arrogance. She had tried to fight the charges, but with the overwhelming evidence of embezzlement and fraud, her lawyers couldn't do much. "The judge wasn't sympathetic, Miss Holloway," he said, peering over his glasses. "Not only did you violate state housing laws, but you stole from your own community, you misused your authority, targeted innocent homeowners, and attempted to use legal loopholes to force a veteran out of his home." Karen remained silent, her jaw clenched tight. "You are hereby sentenced to 2 years of house arrest, ordered to pay restitution to the homeowner association, and barred from ever holding another homeowner association position again." The gavel slammed down, and with that, Karen Holloway's reign of terror was officially over. The grand celebration on the day of the plaque dedication, the entire neighborhood gathered at the newly renamed Harper Park. James stood in front of the brand new flagpole, the largest one in the county, and watched as the American flag was raised high into the sky. As it unfurled, he felt something deep in his chest, a sense of peace, of victory, of justice. Lisa stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "this park is dedicated to a man who stood up for what was right, who never backed down, and who showed us all what real bravery looks like." The crowd cheered. James stepped forward, looking out at the faces of the people he had fought for. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice strong and steady. "It's about all of us. This is a reminder that when we stand together, when we refuse to let tyrants control us, we win. He looked up at the flag, feeling the warm breeze carry it high. This flag stands for freedom, for justice, for the people. And as long as it flies, we remember that no one, not even a homeowner association Karen, can take that away from us. The crowd erupted in applause. And as the sun set on Harper Park, James Harper sat on a park bench with his old friend Tom, watching the flag sway peacefully in the wind. "You know," Tom said, "I don't think Karen's going to like seeing this. From whatever apartment she's stuck in now," James chuckled, shaking his head. "She can look at it all she wants." He took a deep breath, looking out over his home, his community, his victory, because that flag's never coming down.